December 24th, 1945. While the world celebrated the first Christmas of peace, a quiet mountain in West Virginia became the site of history's most chilling systematic extraction. This was not an accidental fire. This was a textbook execution of the architecture of doom, 45 minutes. That is all it took for 5 children to evaporate from the face of the earth. But here is the forensic terror. The laws of physics do not allow a standard house fire to vaporize human bone in under an hour. There were no biological remains, no teeth, no fragments, only a haunting, impossible void. Tonight, we do not look at a tragedy. We analyze a strategic sabotage. The phone lines were cut with surgical precision. The escape routes were blocked. The rescue equipment was neutralized. This was the creation of a biological void, the clinical removal of 5 lives under the cover of smoke. Who were the shadow watchers? Why did the state enforce a strategic silence for over half a century? And whose face was staring back at Jenny Sodder from a photograph mailed 22 years too late? Prepare yourself. You are entering the 10-part deconstruction of the Sodder disappearance. This is not a story about a fire. This is a journey into the mechanics of disappearance and the power of a force that can erase a bloodline and leave nothing but ash. The Festive slaughter, why 1945, was the year celebration died. The disappearance of the Sodder children is not a simple case of a house fire. It is the most sophisticated and chilling execution of a family unit in modern history. On the night of December 24th, 1945, while the world celebrated the first Christmas after the Great War, a strategic erasure took place in Fayetteville, West Virginia. 5 children didn't just perish in a fire. They were extracted from reality by a force that left no biological trace. This was not a tragedy of nature. It was a systematic disarticulation of a family hidden behind a curtain of smoke and holiday cheer. The foundation of this mystery lies in the strategic error of security. The Sodders believed their home was their fortress, but they were being targeted by a compelling unknown force that had been circling their lives for months. This was a psychological and physical siege that turned a night of joy into a clinical slaughterhouse. The premonition of the incendiary void. The horror began with a series of tactical indicators that were fatally ignored. The journey into the void was prepared with cold military precision. The signal of intent. Days before the fire, a stranger appeared at the house, pointing at the fuse boxes and warning that they would cause a fire. It wasn't a warning, it was a tactical threat. The psychological shadow. On the night of the disappearance, a mysterious woman called the house. When Jenny Sodder answered, she heard the sound of clinking glasses and strange laughter before the line went dead. It was the sound of a predator confirming the target's location. The engineering of an extraction. The brilliance of the Sodder mystery isn't just the fire. It's the total systematic sabotage of every survival mechanism within the home. When the flames broke out, the family encountered a scene of calculated, engineered failure. The communication blackout. The telephone lines weren't burned. They were cut with surgical precision from the outside. The mobility kill. George Sodder's trucks, which were vital for reaching the upper windows, were sabotaged. Engines that worked perfectly that morning were suddenly dead. The vanishing assets. The family's heavy-duty ladder was not lost in the fire. It was physically removed from the property and hidden in a nearby embankment. The biological anomaly. When the house finally collapsed into a pile of ash, the most disturbing reality emerged: the total absence of remains. Despite a massive structural fire, not a single bone, tooth, or skull fragment was recovered. Science dictates that a residential fire cannot cremate 5 human bodies in 45 minutes. This was not a death by fire, it was a clean extraction. The children were gone before the first match was struck, and the fire was merely the architecture of the cover-up. By the time the authorities arrived, the strategic silence of the state had already begun, dismissing the event as a tragic accident while ignoring the footprints of a much darker, organized predator. The engineering of a trap, the failure of the domestic defense. The Sodder residence was not just a home, it was a target that had been pre-calibrated for destruction. In part 1, we established the extraction theory, the idea that the 5 children were gone long before the fire reached its peak. Part 2 focuses on the systemic sabotage of the house's survival architecture. In the cold light of forensic analysis, what appeared to be a series of unfortunate accidents reveals itself as a tactical disablement of every escape route and rescue tool available to the family. This was the architecture of an imprisonment. The predator didn't just want the house to burn, they wanted the Sodder family to watch, helpless as their world collapsed. The blackout protocol, cutting the lifeline. The first stage of the assault was the strategic isolation of the family. In 1945, the telephone was the only link to the outside world. The surgical strike. When Jenny Sodder tried to call the fire department, the line was dead. Investigation later confirmed the wires had not been melted by the heat. They had been severed with precision at the top of the pole, 14 feet above the ground. This required a ladder and intent, a clear tactical blackout to delay the arrival of emergency services. The time delay, this single act of sabotage, bought the kidnappers and the fire an extra 2.5 hours of uncontested control over the site. The mobility kill, disarming the father. George Sodder was a man of action, a self-made businessman with a fleet of trucks. His response strategy was to use his vehicles as platforms to reach the attic windows where his children were sleeping. The engine sabotage. George owned 2 massive coal trucks. Both were in perfect mechanical condition the night before. Yet in the heat of the crisis, neither engine would turn over. Forensic logic suggests a tampering of the ignition systems, a classic mobility kill, designed to paralyze the father's ability to intervene. In the vanishing asset, the 22-foot extension ladder, which was bolted to the side of the house, was gone. It didn't burn. It was physically removed and discarded in a hidden embankment 75 feet away. The message was clear. The high ground was denied. The invisible observer, the eye of the predator. The most chilling aspect of the sabotaged fortress is the presence of the external watcher. Weeks before the fire, the Sodder children noticed a strange car parked on the main road, its occupant staring intently at the younger children as they walked home from school. The surveillance phase. This wasn't a random observation. It was the pre-operational intelligence gathering required for a clean extraction. The kidnappers knew the layout, they knew the timing of the holiday festivities, and they knew exactly which wires to cut. By 2 a.m., George Sodder stood in the snow, surrounded by functional tools that had been rendered useless by a ghost in the dark. The house was no longer a shelter. It had been converted into a strategic furnace, designed to incinerate evidence while the unknown force escaped into the Appalachian night with 5 biological assets. The physics of disappearance. Why the ashes refused to speak. In the traditional architecture of a tragedy, the aftermath provides closure through physical evidence. But the Sodder fire produced a biological anomaly that defies the laws of thermodynamics. Part 3 dissects the empty grave phenomenon, the moment when the survivors realized they weren't just mourning a death, but witnessing a total erasure of human matter. This was the strategic deception of the elements. The fire was used not as a weapon of murder, but as a tool of forensic cleansing, designed to create the illusion of death where there was only an absence. The thermal paradox, the fire that shouldn't have consumed. A residential fire in 1945, fueled by wood and coal, typically reaches temperatures between 600 degrees C and 800 degrees C. To completely cremate a human body, including the densest bones, like the skull and pelvic structure, a constant temperature of over 1,000 degrees is required for several hours. The time constraint. The Sodder house burned to the ground in less than 45 minutes. It was a fast, intense flash fire. The forensic impossibility. Even in the most horrific industrial accidents, teeth and small bone fragments remained. Yet after a thorough sifting of the ash, the Sodders found nothing. No skulls, no femurs, no charred remains of 5 growing children. From a biological standpoint, the children did not die in that basement. They were never in the fire to begin with. The basement mystery, the unopened tomb. The official narrative claimed the children were trapped in the attic and fell into the basement as the floors collapsed. But the architecture of the basement told a different story. The preserved goods. Rescuers found unburnt items in the cellar, including kitchen appliances and furniture that were only partially scorched. If the heat wasn't intense enough to melt a washing machine, how could it have vaporized 5 human skeletons? The missing mass. There was no biological shadow, no carbonized imprints that usually occur when organic tissue is subjected to high heat. The void was absolute. The discovery of the strategic plant. Years after the fire, a pathologist was brought in to conduct a private excavation. He found something, but it only deepened the psychological warfare. He discovered several vertebrae, human spinal bones. The tactical error. Upon analysis, it was revealed that the bones showed 0 signs of heat damage. They were dry, aged bones that had been planted in the ash after the fire to satisfy the family's search for closure. The message, the compelling unknown force, wasn't just taking the children. They were actively managing the crime scene, planting false evidence to force the family into a strategic acceptance of death. The conclusion of the void. The biological evidence leads to a singular chilling conclusion. The extraction was successful. The children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were removed from their beds through the very windows George Sodder couldn't reach because his ladder was gone. The fire was the final signature, a massive thermal distraction to cover the tracks of a sophisticated kidnapping. The Sodders were no longer looking for remains. They were looking for survivors in a world that had been scrubbed clean of their existence. The eyes in the dark, pre-operational intelligence, and the witness paradox. In any sophisticated extraction, the execution phase is preceded by a long-term surveillance phase. The Sodder disappearance was not a crime of opportunity. It was a curated event. Part 4 examines the tactical observation that surrounded the family in the weeks leading up to the fire, and the chilling witnesses who saw the extraction in real time while the house was being consumed by the flames. This was the architecture of an oversight. While the family focused on their daily lives, a compelling unknown force was mapping their habits, their weaknesses, and their internal layout. The reconnaissance, the man in the road weeks before the holidays strike, the eldest Sodder children reported a recurring anomaly. A man in a dark sedan was parked on the main highway, constantly watching the younger children as they returned from school. 1. The pattern recognition. This wasn't a random passerby. It was a systematic observation of the children's movements. The predator was identifying the targets, specifically the 5 younger children who would later vanish. The threat assessment. When George Sodder confronted a traveling salesman about the family's safety, the man pointed at the children and delivered a bone-chilling prophecy. Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. This was not a warning. It was a declaration of intent. The live extraction. The witnesses of the night. While George and Jenny were fighting the technical sabotage of their trucks and ladder, the rest of the town was not as blind as the official report suggested. Several individuals saw the architecture of the extraction in motion. The transit observation. A woman operating a tourist stop 50 miles away claimed she served breakfast to the 5 missing children the very next morning. She noted they were accompanied by men in a car with Florida license plates, men who were unfriendly and didn't allow the children to speak. The getaway vehicle. A local bus driver reported seeing a group of people throwing balls of fire, incendiary devices, onto the roof of the Sodder home before speeding away in a dark car. The staging area. Another witness saw the 5 children peering out of a car window while the house was still burning. They weren't screaming for help. They were in a state of psychological shock, being driven away into the Appalachian darkness. The strategic masking, the clinking glasses, called the most disturbing piece of surveillance, occurred just before the first flame was spotted. The mysterious phone call Jenny Sodder received at 12:30 a.m. was not a wrong number. During the audio surveillance, the strange laughter and the sound of glasses clinking in the background was a signal of completion. It was the kidnappers' way of confirming the family was awake, distracted, and precisely where they needed to be before the incendiary phase began. It was the predator toasting to their success while the prey was still on the line. The conclusion of the eye. The surveillance state surrounding the Sodders proves that the fire was merely a cinematic diversion. The children were not victims of a disaster, they were the assets of an operation. They were watched, they were marked, and they were taken under the very noses of a town paralyzed by holiday celebrations. The authorities chose to ignore these witnesses, initiating a strategic silence that would bury these reports for decades, protecting the identities of the watchers who stole the Sodder legacy. The cost of defiance, political friction, and organizational retribution. In the architecture of doom, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. George Sodder was not a random victim. He was a man with a target on his back. Part 5 explores the motive phase, the theory that the disappearance of the 5 children was a strategic retribution orchestrated by the Italian-American underworld. This was not a fire for insurance money. It was a clinical operation designed to punish a man for his political heresy. The kidnapping was the ultimate tax on George Sodder's refusal to conform to the strategic silence of the immigrant community during the rise and fall of fascism. The political heresy, the anti-Mussolini stance. George Sodder was a vocal, aggressive opponent of Benito Mussolini. In a town filled with fellow Italian immigrants who still felt a nationalist loyalty to the old country, George's public denunciations of the dictator were a systemic breach of peace. The friction point, he engaged in heated arguments at the local social clubs. He wasn't just expressing an opinion, he was challenging the social infrastructure of the community. The warning shot. Months before the fire, a salesman, the same man who predicted the fire, told George, "Your children are going to be destroyed for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." This was the formal notification that the compelling unknown force had chosen its target. The Black Hand architecture, a professional hit. The Disappearance bears the fingerprints of the syndicate. In the 1940s, the Black Hand and later organized crime groups specialized in kidnapping as a tool of compliance. The extraction expertise. The ability to cut high-altitude phone lines, sabotage vehicle ignitions, and remove a 22-foot ladder silently requires a tactical precision found only in professional crews. This was an organizational hit, not a random act of arson. The Florida Connection. The witness report of the children in a car with Florida plates aligns with the logistics of the syndicate. Florida was a primary hub for relocated assets and hidden identities within the organization. The children weren't killed. They were redistributed into the system as a permanent punishment for their father. The failure of the local authority, strategic complicity. The most disturbing aspect of the mafia theory is the inaction of the law. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, admitted years later to a bizarre act of forensic tampering. Oh, the buried heart. Morris claimed he found a human heart in the ashes and buried it secretly in a box. When the box was later exhumed, it was found to contain a piece of fresh beef liver that had never been near a fire. The psychological operation. The local authorities weren't just incompetent, they were performing a managed cover-up. Someone had convinced the fire chief to plant false evidence to close the case. This points to a systemic corruption, where the local power structure was under the thumb of the very force that took the children. The conclusion of the bloodline. George Sodder was allowed to live, but his bloodline was severed. The mafia didn't want him dead. They wanted him paralyzed by uncertainty. By taking the children and leaving no bodies, they forced George into a 40-year state of psychological limbo. The architecture of doom was complete. A father silenced by the permanent haunting absence of his legacy. The house was ash, the children were gone, and the code of silence, Omerta, had descended over Fayetteville like a winter shroud. The echoes of extraction, the systematic re-emergence. The fire of 1945 was designed to be a final solution, a thermal erase of the Sodder bloodline. But the architecture of doom has a flaw, the human variable. Part 6 explores the resurfacing phase, the decade-long trail of sightings and reports that suggest the children were not incinerated, but were living as post-war ghosts within a shadow network. This was the strategic survival of a mystery that refused to stay buried in the West Virginia ash. If the children were dead, the story ends in 1945. If they were seen, the fire was merely the prologue to a lifetime of captivity. The Charleston manifestation, the identity crisis. 2 years after the extraction, a witness in Charleston, West Virginia, provided a report that shattered the official accidental death narrative. 1. The visual confirmation. A woman at a high-end hotel claimed she saw the 5 children accompanied by 2 women and 2 men of Italian descent. 2. The behavioral anomaly. When she tried to speak to the children in a friendly manner, one of the men looked at her with a hostile glare and began speaking rapidly in Italian. The group immediately retreated. This was a managed environment where the children were being moved like high-value assets under constant guard. The Texas connection. The letter from the void. In the early 1950s, the Sodders received a tip from a woman in Texas who claimed that Martha, one of the missing daughters, was living there. The investigation breach. George Sodder traveled to Texas alone, a desperate tactical sortie into the unknown. He found the girl, but she denied her identity. Forensic psychologists suggest this is a classic case of identity erasure, where young children, under the threat of violence or through psychological conditioning, are forced to adopt cover identities until their original memories become a psychological fog. The strategic displacement. The children weren't kept together. They were likely atomized, separated and placed in different states to prevent a collective escape or a mass identification. The St. Louis sighting. The institutional shadow. Another disturbing report came from a school in St. Louis. A witness claimed to have seen Jenny Sodder, the daughter, in a Catholic convent. The wall of silence. When George attempted to verify this, he was met with a systemic denial from the religious authorities. The architecture of doom extended beyond the criminal underworld. It reached into institutions that provided a sacred shield for the kidnappers. The children were being hidden in plain sight, protected by the very fabric of post-war society. The conclusion of the ghost. By 1959, the same year the Dyatlov group met their end in Russia, the Sodders had spent 14 years chasing ghosts. Every lead followed a specific tactical pattern. A sighting, a confrontation, and a sudden disappearance of the suspects. The compelling unknown force was always one step ahead, utilizing a network of safe houses and shadow families to keep the assets hidden. The Sodders realized that their children were no longer theirs. They had been integrated into a parallel reality, a secret life where their names, their language, and their past had been systematically bleached from their minds. The 1967 breach, a face from the digital abyss. For 22 years, the Sodder mystery existed only in the realm of theory, whispers, and a haunting absence of physical evidence. But in 1967, the strategic silence was shattered by a single envelope. Part 7 dissects the optical confirmation phase, the moment a ghost materialized through a camera lens, providing the first undeniable evidence that the extraction zone was real. This was not a rumor or a sighting. It was a visual breach, a direct message from the void that proved the children hadn't just survived. They had aged under the shadow of their new masters. This was the architecture of a taunt. The predator was no longer hiding in the smoke. They were showing the prey exactly what they had stolen and how they had reshaped it. The Kentucky postmark, the anonymous dispatch. One morning, Jenny Sodder opened the mail to find a letter postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address, no signature, only a photograph and a cryptic sequence of characters. The photo depicted a young man in his late 20s with dark, curly hair who possessed the distinct dark eyes, the Sodder nose, and the exact brow structure of Louis Sodder, who was only 9 at the time of the fire. On the back of the photo, a handwritten message read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil boys." A 90132 or 90135. This was not a casual note. It was a coded transmission. The numbers resembled a postal code, a military serial, or a tactical marker of where Louis had been processed within the shadow system. The forensic analysis, the adult silhouette. The Sodders immediately hired a private investigator to track the origin of the photo in Kentucky, but the investigator disappeared shortly after taking the case, another systemic failure in the family's defense. When comparing the 1967 photo to the 1945 childhood photos of Louis, the anatomical alignment was nearly 100%. The compelling unknown force had allowed Louis to send a message, or perhaps Louis had managed a brief tactical leak of his own existence from within his captivity. Why send the photo now? It arrived when George and Jenny were elderly and vulnerable. It was a reminder of the loss, a way to reset the clock of their suffering just as they were nearing the end of their lives, ensuring the wound remained open. The Frankie variable, the internal link, the mention of brother Frankie was a high-fidelity detail. Frankie was one of the Sodder brothers who had survived the fire and was still living. This proved the sender had internal intelligence of the family dynamics. Louis, if it was indeed him, was reaching out to the only unextracted sibling he felt a connection to. It was a cry for help from across the socio-political barrier that separated his secret life from his original home. The conclusion of the image. The photograph became the centerpiece of the famous Sodder billboard on Route 19. They displayed it to the world, a visual defiance against the kidnappers. But the architecture of doom responded with absolute stasis. No one in Kentucky came forward. No police agency followed the lead with any real force. The image of Louis Sodder remained a frozen signal, a proof of life that offered no path to rescue. He was a man with a face, but no legal existence, a permanent resident of the underworld infrastructure, leaving his parents to stare at a photograph of a son they could see, but never touch. The war of visibility, strategic defiance against the silence. By the 1950s, the Sodder family realized that the official investigation was not a failure of competence, but a deliberate act of strategic stagnation. The state wanted the case to dissolve into the past. Part 8 examines the architecture of resistance, the moment George and Jenny Sodder decided to turn their private grief into a public psychological offensive. They erected a monument of defiance on Route 19, a massive billboard that served as a permanent sentinel, forcing every passerby, local official, and potential kidnapper to look into the eyes of the missing. This was the tactical counter-siege. If the compelling unknown force wanted the children to be forgotten, the Sodders would make their faces the most unavoidable landmark in West Virginia. The Route 19 Memorial, a psychological fortress. The billboard was not just an advertisement, it was a forensic summary of the crime. It featured the photos of the 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, along with a detailed list of the sabotage, the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, and the sabotaged trucks. It was a public indictment of the local authorities. By placing this monument on a major highway, the Sodders created a constant surveillance of the community. They were telling the kidnappers, who they believed still lived among them or watched from the shadows, that the clock of justice had not stopped. The sentinels told, the burden of hope. For over 40 years, the billboard stood as a psychological barrier between the town and its desired normalcy. Jenny Sodder took the role of the eternal watcher. She dressed in black every day for the rest of her life, a perpetual mourning that served as a visual reminder of the extraction. She meticulously maintained a garden at the site of the fire, turning the ground where her children supposedly died into a tactical memorial. This was the architecture of memory used as a weapon. Every time a local official drove past that billboard, they were reminded of the systemic failure they had overseen. The strategic defiance, rejecting the death certificate. The government repeatedly attempted to issue death certificates for the children to close the legal files. George Sodder refused. To accept a death certificate was to accept the thermal erase theory, which he knew to be a biological impossibility. By maintaining the children's legal status as missing, he kept the extraction zone active. He spent his life's fortune on private investigators and travel, chasing leads across the country, performing a series of tactical sorties into the underworld to find a breach in the shadow network. The conclusion of the Sentinel, the billboard became a symbol of the American Dyatlov, a mystery that refused to be buried. It stood long after George and Jenny passed away, a silent witness to a crime that had been engineered to be forgotten. The Sentinel on Route 19 proved that while the compelling unknown force could steal the children's bodies, they could not erase their presence from the collective consciousness of the world. The Sodders died without answers, but their billboard ensured that the secret of the 1945 New Year's night would remain a bleeding wound in the heart of the Appalachian landscape. The theoretical spectrum mapping the predator. In the final stages of a mystery, the focus shifts from the victims to the entity responsible for the disruption of reality. Part 9 examines the theoretical spectrum, the three primary suspects behind the systematic extraction of the Sodder children. This was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated operation requiring a specific motive, a professional infrastructure, and the power to enforce a strategic silence for over half a century. We must look at the architects of annihilation to understand why the 1945 New Year's night was chosen as the moment for this high-stakes social surgery. This was the architecture of a conspiracy. Each theory provides a different lens through which the disappearance becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Theory 1, the Mafia Retribution, the blood tax. The strongest forensic theory points to the Italian-American syndicate. George Sodder's public defiance of Mussolini was more than political. It was a breach of the nationalist infrastructure that the Mafia protected. Under this theory, the fire was a professional signature. The kidnapping of the 5 children was a blood tax designed to punish George without the mercy of killing him. By taking the children and moving them through a network of safe houses in Florida and Kentucky, the syndicate transformed George's life into a permanent psychological prison. The sabotage of the trucks and phone lines was a standard tactical protocol for Mafia hits during the 1940s. Theory 2, the communist extraction, the political leverage. Another darker possibility involves the post-war tensions of the early Cold War. Some investigators suggested that the children were taken as political assets by agents connected to the very ideologies George Sodder criticized. In this scenario, the children weren't just stolen. They were re-educated or used as leverage against the growing immigrant influence in West Virginia. This would explain the systemic failure of the FBI and local government to pursue the case. It wasn't just a local crime, but a matter of national security that required a total blackout of information. Theory 3, the child trafficking ring, the biological commodity. The 1940s was an era where black market adoptions were a booming high-profit industry. This theory suggests that the Sodder children were selected based on their health, age, and appearance. They were viewed as biological commodities. The fire was an incendiary distraction, used to cover the tracks of a human trafficking operation that had identified the Sodder home as a vulnerable target. The strange woman who called the house and the men watching from the car were spotters for this network. This would explain why the children were seen in hotel lobbies and restaurants. They were being displayed to buyers before being moved into their new stolen lives. The conclusion of the architect, regardless of which theory holds the ultimate truth, they all share one common foundation: the strategic sabotage of the truth. Each architect required the complicity of the local law enforcement and the silence of the neighbors. The compelling unknown force wasn't just a person. It was a system of power that dictated who was allowed to exist and who was destined to be erased. As we move toward the final chapter, we realize that the real horror isn't just that the children disappeared, but that the world was engineered to let them vanish without a trace. The legacy of the void, the end of the watch. The Sodder mystery concludes not with a discovery, but with a strategic dissolution. After decades of defiance, billboard sentinels, and chasing shadows across state lines, the physical voices of the search have fallen silent. Part 10 examines the post-operational reality, the legacy left behind by a family that refused to accept the thermal erase of their bloodline. This is the architecture of a permanent wound, a story that has transitioned from a criminal investigation into a haunting piece of American folklore, proving that some voids can never be filled. This was the victory of the strategic silence. The compelling unknown force succeeded in its primary objective: the total and irreversible displacement of 5 human beings. The passing of the Sentinels. George Sodder died in 1969, just 2 years after receiving the mysterious photograph from Kentucky. He died in a state of tactical exhaustion, having spent his life's energy fighting a ghost. Jenny Sodder lived until 1989, maintaining her black attire and her garden of remembrance for 44 years. When the last of the original parents passed, the billboard on Route 19 was finally taken down. The visual defiance was over. The physical landmark that had forced the world to remember was gone, leaving only the empty space where a home and a family once stood. The forensic aftermath, the modern perspective. Today, the site of the Sodder home is nothing more than a grassy patch of land in Fayetteville. But the digital architecture of the mystery continues to grow. Modern forensic experts, using the data we have analyzed over these 10 parts, remain unanimous. The official fire theory is a scientific impossibility. The lack of biological remains, the cut phone lines, and the sabotaged trucks point to a multi-level conspiracy that required high-level coordination. Whether it was the mafia, a trafficking ring, or a political hit, the operation was a flawless success. The final signature, what remains? The Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, would be in their 80s or 90s today. If they are still alive, they exist as the ultimate deep-cover assets. People whose original identities were incinerated on a cold New Year's night in 1945. They are the human echoes of the architecture of doom. The real tragedy is the generational trauma. The fact that a father, a mother, and 4 surviving siblings were forced to live in a reality where 5 of their own were converted into optical proofs and post-war ghosts. The conclusion of the nightmare. As we close the file on the New Year's nightmare, we are left with a chilling realization. The world is not always governed by logic or justice. It is often shaped by compelling unknown forces that operate in the shadows of our celebrations. The Sodder fire was the perfect incendiary cover, a tactical masterpiece that used the chaos of a holiday to erase a future. We remember the Sodders not because we found them, but because their absence is so loud that it continues to echo through the mountains of West Virginia, a permanent reminder that on the night of the new year, the darkness is at its most predatory.